I can't breathe. Please, I need my inhaler. That's what Carla Morris gasped, her voice barely audible as Officer Grant slammed her face onto the cold concrete, her chest tightening with every passing second. She was pulled over on a quiet street, not for a crime, but for something as small as a forgotten license tag. Her inhaler, a lifeline, was in her purse, ignored and tossed to the side like it didn't matter. She begged, but Officer Grant didn't listen. Her last breath was taken alone, the sound of her struggle drowned by the officer's indifference. Hours later, Carla lay in a jail cell, her body slumped, still and silent. When Marcus Morris heard that his mother had died from asthma complications, the news didn't shake him. He didn't scream or cry. He simply stood still, his jaw clenched tight. Because Marcus knew, the system didn't fail his mother, it murdered her. And when the law won't act, vengeance becomes a mission. One by one, the cops, the judge, and the nurse who let her die would fall. No warning, no mercy. This is the story of how Marcus Morris became the nightmare stalking every officer who let his mother die. Welcome to Dark Crime. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories. Marcus Morris stood motionless as the officer on the other end of the line spoke the words he had been dreading. Your mother, Carla Morris, has passed away in custody. She died from complications due to asthma. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. His mother had been healthy, strong, the kind of woman who refused to let anything break her. Yet somehow she was dead, left alone in a cold jail cell, gasping for air with no one to listen. The officer's voice was distant, detached, almost as if he were reading from a script. She couldn't get to her inhaler in time. It's a tragedy, sir. A medical emergency. The phone slipped from Marcus's hand, landing softly on the floor. He closed his eyes, holding his breath. Carla's last words echoed in his mind. Please. I need my inhaler. I can't breathe. It was almost as if he could hear her voice crack, each word wrapped in desperation, floating through the phone. His mother had pleaded for help, but no one cared. There was no screaming, no tears. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't throw his phone across the room. He didn't even let out a breath. He simply stood there, stone still, eyes closed, clenching, his fists as the weight of the truth crashed over him. The system had failed his mother. It had killed her. In the silence that followed, Marcus thought back to that moment when he had last spoken to her. Her warm laugh, her voice full of life, and now it was gone, but something deep inside him shifted. The anger, the pain. It would be controlled. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't cry. Marcus wasn't raised to fold, wasn't trained to beg for justice. No, he would get it. He would make them pay. Every last one of them, the cops, the judge, the nurse who had watched his mother struggle. They would all fall. And Marcus would make sure they felt the same helplessness his mother did in her last moments. Marcus didn't speak to anyone that night. He didn't call his cousins, his boys, or even the friends who had been there since day one. Instead, he sat in the dim light of his living room, the weight of the world on his chest, replaying everything in his mind. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had taught him to be strong, to survive, to never let the world break him, was dead. And no one had even tried to help her. Carla Morris had lived a life of resilience. A woman who had come from nothing, who fought for every single thing she had, her family, her respect, her own peace of mind. She had been a fighter in every sense of the word. Whether it was making ends meet in the rundown neighborhood where Marcus was raised, or standing up to a world that constantly tried to keep her down, Carla fought. She had always been there for Marcus. Always. No matter how tough the world got, she was there to remind him that he wasn't alone. When things got hard, when the streets got rough, it was Carla's voice that echoed in his mind, telling him to keep moving, to keep fighting, to never show weakness. And yet, when it was her turn to ask for help, the system, the same system, that she had given everything to survive, had turned its back on her. Her last moments had been filled with desperation. She had begged for her inhaler, something so simple, so vital to her survival. But the officer in charge, Officer Harris, had ignored her plea, rolling his eyes as he watched her struggle. He hadn't cared. She wasn't a person to him. Just Another statistic. Just another name to be swept under the rug. As Carla's breath began to fade, it wasn't just the lack of air that took her life. It was the indifference. The cold, heartless indifference of a system built to protect its own, no matter the cost to those beneath it. Marcus would never forget the sound of her voice that night, fading, pleading. He would never forget the image of her shaking hands, reaching out for something that could have saved her. And then there was Officer Harris, a man who had treated his mother like an afterthought, a man who would go home that night, unaware that his indifference would lead to his own downfall. He didn't see her as a mother, a woman, a person. She was just a name on a report, something easily dismissed. But for Marcus, she was everything. She was his world. Then there was Jessica Kane, the one who had signed the papers, covered the tracks, and played her part in the death of an innocent woman. She was sympathetic, perhaps even guilty, but pragmatic enough to follow the orders. Her job was to close the case, not to seek justice. In her mind, Carla's death was just a tragic accident, nothing more. For Marcus, this wasn't just a loss. This was betrayal. And his path from this moment on would be driven by one thing: revenge. The people who had let his mother die, those who had stood by while the system stole her life away, they would pay. He called the hospital, asked for the records. But when he did, there was a strange hesitation on the other end of the line. "I'm afraid the records are sealed for privacy reasons," the clerk said, but Marcus knew better. He hung up the phone without a word and sat back in his chair, staring at the wall. They were hiding something. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference. But Marcus was determined to dig it up. It was late that night when Marcus slipped out of his apartment and drove to the police station. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew the place to start: Officer Harris. The officer who had been the first to dismiss his mother's pleas for help. The officer who had stood there, cuffing her, watching her inhale ragged breaths, and doing nothing. He wasn't going to let Harris hide behind his badge any longer. He had to know what the police were really covering up. As Marcus parked across the street from the station, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think. He wasn't here for a confrontation. Not yet. Not until he had the truth. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He waited, watching the officers move in and out of the building, not knowing he was watching them. His eyes followed Harris as he walked out of the station, his shoulders stiff, eyes sharp, as if he knew he was being watched. Marcus didn't approach him, though. Not yet. That would come later. Patience was key. The next day, Marcus made a call that set his plan in motion. He reached out to an old friend, someone he had known from the streets. He wasn't looking for a fight, not yet, but he needed information. The kind of information that couldn't be found in official reports. He needed someone on the inside. "Hey, man," Marcus said into the phone, "I need you to dig around for me. I need to know what's going on with that report about my mom. Find me some answers." His friend hesitated, then agreed. "I'll see what I can do. But you know things in this town don't come easy, right?" "I know," Marcus replied, "but I'm done waiting. I need answers now." A few days later, the first crack in the wall appeared. Marcus's friend had come through. He had managed to dig up the official autopsy report, one that was supposed to be sealed. It was a simple, sterile document that listed asthma complications as the cause of death. But that was a lie. It was clear, even from the way the report was written, that it had been manipulated. The inconsistencies were too glaring to ignore. The missing signatures, the incomplete medical history, and the most glaring of all, the lack of any mention of Carla's inhaler, which had been in her purse when the officers first arrested her. Marcus's fingers trembled as he read through the pages, each line sinking deeper into his chest. He could hear his mother's voice again, her voice begging for something so simple. "I can't breathe." The officer had watched her die and did nothing. The anger that had been simmering in Marcus for days now boiled over. They didn't just fail her, they killed her. His mother had begged for help, and they had ignored her. Now it was his turn to act. He walked into his apartment and immediately opened his drawer, pulling out the photos of Officer Harris, the district attorney, and the nurse who had been on duty that night. He knew the faces. He knew their names. He knew where they lived, but that wasn't enough. He had to understand the system, to get to the core of the corruption that had cost his mother her life. Marcus wasn't just seeking justice. He was about to take it. The police had written her off. The district attorney had signed the papers and filed it away. But Marcus Morris wasn't going to let this slide. No more lies. No more cover-ups. And that night, as he sat in front of the police station again, watching Officer Harris walk out of the building, Marcus's hands clenched into fists. His voice, though silent, was clear in his mind. This time, there would be no silence. He was ready to make them listen, and he would do it in the only language they understood. Marcus spent the next few days methodically watching. He didn't rush. He didn't make a single reckless move. The rage that had burned hot in his chest when he first heard the news of his mother's death was now a cold, calculating fire. Every moment was carefully planned, every detail studied. He had learned that the system wouldn't break until he made it. And that meant finding Officer Harris, the first man who had watched his mother suffocate and had done nothing. Harris had been the one who arrested her, the one who had cuffed her hands, watched her gasp for air, and refused to give her an inhaler. The officer was no stranger to Marcus. He'd seen him around the neighborhood, swaggering down the streets with an air of superiority, like he owned the place. Now, Marcus was going to make him feel like a man who was being hunted. Marcus didn't follow him immediately. He didn't just jump into the fight. That wasn't his style. He had learned long ago that survival was about patience. He knew exactly where Harris lived, where he worked, and where he spent his downtime. The trick wasn't to catch him in one wild, frenzied rush. It was to get closer until Harris had nowhere to hide. For days, Marcus followed Harris, observing from a distance. He watched the officer leave his apartment early in the morning, always walking with his head held high, his eyes never once scanning the crowd for danger. Harris was cocky. He thought he was untouchable. That would be his downfall. Marcus studied the rhythms of Harris's life. The officer always took the same route to work, grabbed the same coffee from the same cafe, and hit the gym at the same time every evening. His life was predictable, and that was exactly what Marcus needed. The tension was thick in the air as Marcus grew closer, but he knew that now was not the time. Patience, precision. He kept his distance, even as he saw Harris enjoying his life. Carefree, laughing with friends at bars, oblivious to the storm that was coming. Each time Marcus watched Harris live his normal life, he couldn't help but remember his mother. Carla's face always flashed in his mind. He remembered how she had looked at him when she was healthy, full of life and laughter, teaching him to be strong. But now, the face that appeared in his mind was the one he would never forget. Face of his mother, gasping for breath, asking for help, and not getting it. Her last breath was stolen from her by men like Harris, men who treated her as less than human. As Marcus watched the officer enjoy his carefree existence, he could feel the emotional weight growing heavier. He was always one step behind. Always. Watching, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about making Harris feel that same desperation his mother had felt. He wanted him to understand what it was like to beg for something that could save your life, and have it denied. He wanted Harris to know the suffocating weight of helplessness. It was the following Saturday when the plan started to take shape. Marcus knew that Harris would be at the gym again, finishing his routine before grabbing a late-night bite at the diner near the station. The officer's habits were predictable, and now Marcus had everything he needed. He parked his car a few blocks away from the gym, making sure to stay out of Harris's line of sight. He checked his watch. The gym would be closing soon. It was the perfect time. As Harris stepped out of the building, Marcus followed him from a distance, keeping to the shadows. The cold night air bit at his skin, but Marcus barely felt it. His focus was razor-sharp. No mistakes. He followed Harris down the same street, watching as the officer stepped into the diner, his body language casual, his mind at ease. Harris had no idea what was waiting for him. Marcus stood across the street, just far enough to remain unseen. He watched through the diner's window as Harris took a seat at the counter, ordering the same food he always did. Comfortable, relaxed. Officer had no clue that his life was about to be flipped upside down, but Marcus didn't move yet. He knew he had to let Harris be at his weakest. Let him feel the normalcy of his life, right before it shattered. He didn't want to just kill him. That wasn't the point. He wanted Harris to understand the kind of pain his mother had gone through. The helplessness of begging for something as simple as breath. Was an hour before Harris left the diner, stumbling slightly as he walked to his car, likely still groggy from a few drinks. Marcus followed, staying far behind. He could feel his pulse quicken. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he followed Harris into the parking lot. The officer's car was parked at the far end of the lot, where the streetlights were dim. Perfect. Marcus waited, his heart beat steadily in his chest. This wasn't about anger anymore. This wasn't about the rage that had filled him in those first moments of grief. This was about justice. Not the kind that could be served in a courtroom, but the kind that had been denied to his mother. The officer was careless, always too comfortable in his routine, believing his badge made him untouchable. That was his mistake. Marcus wasn't here for anger. He wasn't here to make noise. He didn't need to shout or cry out his grief. What he needed was to make sure Harris understood the helplessness that had claimed his mother's life. The desperation, the suffocating terror of not being able to breathe, of reaching for something, anything to save you, and having it ripped away. In one swift motion, Marcus reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small, silenced pistol. That had been waiting for this moment. His hand was steady, his breathing calm. This was not a moment of rage. It was a mission, and missions were about precision. About control. Harris was just a few feet from his car now, and Marcus was almost close enough to hear the officer's muttered curse as he struggled with his keys. There was no panic in Marcus's mind, no second thoughts. There was only the mission, the justice his mother would never receive from the system. He moved swiftly, silently, his boots barely making a sound on the cold pavement. Harris didn't see him coming. The shot was clean. The officer's body slumped forward instantly, crumpling like a ragdoll. The gunshot didn't echo in the night. It was swallowed by the silence. No scream, no fight. Just the cold finality of death. Harris's body hit the ground softly, and the world around Marcus held still for a moment. He stood over the officer, his breath steady, but inside, something was stirring. Regret? No, it wasn't regret. Not yet. There was no satisfaction in this. Not in the way he had imagined. No sense of triumph. It felt like the completion of a task. A job well done. But as he stood there, looking down at the man who had taken his mother's life with such indifference, he couldn't help but think of her again. Carla's face, her warmth, her laughter, her final cry for help. Please, I need my inhaler. I can't breathe. Marcus knelt down and retrieved the small note he had prepared earlier. It was simple, the ink still fresh. He placed it on the officer's windshield, so it would be the first thing anyone saw when they arrived. She deserved to breathe. It was the same message Marcus had carried with him since the day he learned of his mother's death. A reminder, not just for Harris, but for everyone who had turned a blind eye. A message that spoke louder than any gunshot could. A message for the department. With the note in place, Marcus turned and walked away, his footsteps silent, his mind strangely calm. The tension, the weight of the revenge that had been building inside him, started to dissipate. The first step was taken, but there was still more to do. The others were still out there. They had all played their part in his mother's death. They all had to pay. As Marcus reached his car, his hand rested for a moment on the door handle. He could still feel the weight of the gun in his coat pocket, but there was no satisfaction in it. Only the growing realization that this path, this journey he had started, would never give him back his mother. But this was the world they had created. This was the system that had failed him. That had failed Carla. The police department was on high alert. The first kill had ignited something in the city, something raw and dangerous. News outlets were swarming, their cameras capturing every angle of the ongoing investigation. Headlines screamed about a vigilante killer on the loose. The community was paralyzed by fear. Citizens whispered in hushed voices about the mysterious figure who was taking down officers, one by one. The calls to action were loud. Justice. For Carla Morris, they said. But the officers were terrified. The very people meant to uphold the law, now feeling hunted by their own Marcus, watched it all unfold from his small apartment. The chaos had started, and he was the one pulling the strings. Officer Harris had been the first, but the world wasn't done with the consequences yet. The city was in an uproar, and the police department was scrambling to make sense of the events. But no one was close. They were chasing shadows, hoping for a break that wouldn't come. Marcus had already chosen his next target, Nurse Linda Moore, the woman who had witnessed his mother struggle in that cold, unforgiving jail cell. She had been in the room when Carla had begged for help, when her breath had turned into nothing more than shallow gasps. Moore was the one who had walked past Carla while she pleaded, too caught up in the routine of her shift to notice the life slipping away from the woman. In front of her, Marcus had no intention of letting her escape the consequences of her indifference. She had blood on her hands, just like Harris. The city had a face now, and so did the system. Moore would pay, but as he planned his next move, the police grew more desperate. Detective Ree was assigned to the case, and his frustration was evident. In every briefing, every public statement, dead ends. There were no witnesses, no clues, no physical evidence left behind. Every piece of the puzzle led to nothing. It was as if the killer had vanished into the night, a shadow moving too swiftly for anyone to catch. The more the police panicked, the more they drove themselves into a corner. They had no idea what kind of man they were chasing. They could feel the walls closing in on them, tightening with every passing day. The city was awake, and it was watching. Fear swept through the streets, but it was not just fear of the killer anymore. It was the realization that no one was safe. For Marcus, this wasn't just about the chase. It wasn't just about the people who had wronged his mother. It was about making them all feel it, the helplessness, the terror, the suffocation. As the police scrambled to find answers, Marcus continued his investigation, but he wasn't just chasing vengeance now. Something had shifted inside him. The man who had started this path was no longer the same. He was becoming someone else, someone far removed from the young son who had watched his mother suffer. Every death, every piece of the puzzle was making him colder. More methodical. It was one thing to kill for justice, but another to kill for the satisfaction of seeing those who had wronged you suffer. The truth was, Marcus wasn't sure what he was becoming anymore. He wasn't sure if he was still fighting for his mother, or if he was simply enjoying the power that came with taking lives. The murder of Nurse Moore would be next. But as the day of the planned attack approached, Marcus found himself questioning, not his purpose, but the man he had become. He had lost something along the way. As the sun set that evening, Marcus caught a glimpse of himself in the bathroom mirror. His face was drawn, his eyes hard, like a man who had learned to live without feeling. He had started this mission because of the pain, the anger that came from losing his mother in such a senseless way. But now, what was he becoming? Was he just another monster? Was he becoming the thing he hated? The tension inside him was mounting, but Marcus had no time to think about it. The city was already on edge. Another cop had been murdered. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The police had no leads, and they were desperate. Desperation was a dangerous thing, but it was a thing Marcus knew how to use. The moment had arrived for Nurse Moore. He was ready. But as he moved closer, his thoughts drifted back to the last time he had seen his mother's face. Her love, her strength, her care. He had watched her fight for survival, for him. But what had he become in the process? The police, now fully aware that a vigilante was picking them off one by one, were at a breaking point. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They were cornered. No one wanted to speak up. No one wanted to face the reality of the situation. The streets of the city felt thick with tension, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for the next step in the vendetta to unfold. As Marcus got closer to Nurse Moore, he realized that he wasn't hunting just for her. He was hunting for the same thing he had been seeking all along, justice. But the price of that justice was slowly turning him into something else, someone he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. With every step closer to Moore, Marcus felt his resolve growing stronger, but also more distant from the person he once was. The monster was emerging, piece by piece, and with it, The realization that he had become exactly what he sought to destroy. The city had no idea what was coming next. Marcus had already made his decision. The police were coming undone, desperate for answers. But they wouldn't find him. No one would. The night was quieter than usual, the streets drenched in the kind of silence that feels heavy with anticipation. Marcus had already begun his approach, his hands steady on the wheel as he drove toward the district attorney's office, where Jessica Kane was wrapping up another long day of legal battles. She had been the final piece of the puzzle, the woman who had signed off on his mother's false cause of death, and who had played her part in hiding the truth. Kane had been smart, too clever for her own good. She knew how to cover her tracks, how to make the system bend and twist in her favor, and for that, she'd gotten away with more than most. But she hadn't accounted for Marcus. She hadn't realized that her role in Carla's death would not go unpunished. Marcus parked a few blocks down and slipped into the shadows. His movements were calm, deliberate. He had prepared for this moment for weeks, and now, as he stood in the darkness outside her office building, he felt no fear. Just resolve. His footsteps were silent on the pavement as he approached the building's back entrance. The security guard was finishing his cigarette break, unaware that the man who had been hunting down the city's injustice was only a few steps away. Marcus slipped past him, using the small amount of time he had to his advantage. He was always one step ahead. Inside the building, Jessica Kane was sitting in her office, reviewing the last case of the day. The lights were dim, casting long shadows over her desk. She was tired, no doubt, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from trying to balance justice with self-preservation. But as she sat there, reviewing legal documents and ignoring the growing unease in the back of her mind, she didn't know that Marcus was already inside the building. Marcus's face was calm, his heart steady. This was it, the final act of upness. Play that had been written long ago, when Carla had taken her last breath in that cold cell. The moment when justice would finally be served. But this wouldn't be a courtroom verdict. This would be something more primal, something personal. As Marcus reached the door to her office, he paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. He could feel his heartbeat, steady but quiet, almost like he was waiting for the inevitable to come crashing down. Then he pushed the door open. Kane looked up from her desk, startled. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. Marcus had spent the last few weeks keeping a low profile, moving through the city like a shadow. But when her eyes locked onto his, something clicked. She knew who he was. "You," she whispered, taking a step back as her eyes darted to the phone on her desk. "You're the one who's been ... Her voice trailed off as she stood up, backing toward the door. "What do you want?" Marcus didn't move. He simply stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving hers. "I want what you took from me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had been through. Every moment of pain, every sleepless night, all of it now coiled tightly inside him. She had taken his mother's life, and in doing so, had forced him down this path of vengeance. "I don't know what you think this is," Kane said, her voice trembling now. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I didn't," Marcus cut her off with a single movement. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did." She faltered, glancing around the office. Her mind raced, calculating, trying to figure out a way to escape. But there was no escape for her. Not anymore. The law she had spent her life upholding had failed his mother, and now it would be her turn to pay. "I can make this right." She tried again, her voice rising, desperation creeping in. "I can fix this. Just let me." Before she could finish, Marcus took another step forward, his presence now filling the space between them. There was no more time for words. With a swift, precise motion, Marcus pulled the gun from his coat pocket. The weapon gleamed in the dim light of the office, its cold steel reflecting the faint glow of the city outside. He had done this before, with Harris, with others, but this time felt different. This was the end. Jessica Kane stared at the gun, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she whispered, her eyes wide, her hands shaking as she raised them in a futile gesture of surrender. "Please don't." Marcus didn't flinch. He raised the gun, his fingers steady on the trigger, and without a single second of hesitation, he pulled it. The sound of the shot was sharp and final, cutting through the air with the precision of a practiced hand. Kane's body collapsed in a heap, her face frozen in a final, terrified expression. Marcus didn't move for a moment. The room was silent again, except for the faint hum of the city outside. He stared at her body, his heart still steady, his breathing calm. It was over, but as he stood there, something shifted within him. For a brief moment, a fleeting doubt tugged at his chest. Doubt, had he become the thing he once hated? He looked down at the lifeless body of the woman who had helped bury the truth. She had been just one more cog in the wheel, a wheel that had crushed his mother's life. But was he now the same as the people who had destroyed everything he loved? No, this was Justice. His hand shook for a split second as he holstered the gun, but he quickly regained control. There was no satisfaction here, no joy, only completion. The mission was over. The last person who had stood in the way of the truth was gone. As he turned and walked out of the office, Marcus felt the weight of what he had done settle heavily on his chest. But there was no turning back now. The path was chosen, and it had already taken him too far. The city was still in chaos. The headlines screamed about the vigilante killer who had taken down several officers and a district attorney, leaving the city gripped by fear and anger. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the police were left chasing shadows, their every move met with silence. No suspects, no clues, no witnesses. The figure who had hunted them down, one by one, had vanished into the night, just like a ghost. Marcus's legend had grown, but so had the emptiness inside him. He had completed his mission. Each death, each target, had fallen perfectly into place. But there was no triumph, no sense of victory. He had expected to feel something more, but instead, he felt nothing. He had disappeared, just as he had planned. There were no traces, no footprints left behind. His apartment was cleared out, his personal effects vanished, and he was now a mere shadow in the city's history. Marcus Morris, the man who had exacted his vengeance, was now gone. His name would fade, just like the police officers he had killed. The system was still standing. The city was still broken, and no one was any closer to true justice. He had killed, and for what? To silence his mother's screams? To right an unending wrong? He wasn't sure anymore. The more he reflected, the more the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He remembered the first time he had held a gun in his hand, the first time he had looked into someone's eyes, knowing that pulling the trigger would end their life. It had been about revenge then, pure and simple. But now, it felt like he had become something else. A monster. The streets of the city continued their relentless march forward. People came and went, unaffected by the invisible war that had been waged in their midst. News reports shifted focus, and new stories emerged. The system continued to function. As cold and unyielding as ever. As Marcus disappeared into the shadows, he was reminded of his mother's face, her smile, and the warmth that had once filled their home. She had been the light in his life, the reason he had fought so hard to survive. But that light was now gone, replaced by the hollow, cold reality of what he had become. He had promised her justice, but now he wondered if it had been worth it. Had her death been avenged? Yes, but at what cost? There was no satisfaction in the silence that followed. The city, once alive with the pulse of life, had turned inward, trembling under the weight of its own corruption. The police continued their efforts, each one more desperate than the last, trying to find someone to blame. But they were chasing ghosts. Marcus moved like one himself. Gone underground, he had become the very thing he had hunted. The world would never know his true identity, and perhaps in some way, he was grateful for that. He had become invisible. The streets were no longer his home. The people he once knew were now far away. It was as if he had never existed at all. Marcus's final thoughts often drifted back to the moment before each kill. The look in his mother's eyes, those final moments when she had realized that no one was coming, that no one cared. He could feel the weight of it in his bones now, like it was a part of him. He had told himself that the pain would go away once the killing stopped, that he would find peace in the silence that followed. But the silence was deafening. As the days passed, Marcus found a quiet corner to exist in. Somewhere far away from the noise of the city, the weight of his vengeance lifted. But there was still no satisfaction, no peace. His actions had not fixed the system. They had not brought back his mother. Closure? No. The finality of his journey only brought him closer to the realization that the world would always turn. People would move on. The city would forget. He could still hear the distant sound of protests, the chants that had filled the streets in the aftermath. She deserved to breathe, they had cried. But those voices were slowly fading. The system, indifferent as always, would survive. It would keep turning, and Marcus knew it would never change. His revenge had been necessary, but pointless. The moment he had pulled the trigger, the moment he had silenced his targets, he had become part of the system he hated. And now he was nothing more than a ghost, lost in the shadows of a city that didn't care about the things he had done. The weight of his actions lingered, but Marcus had nothing left to say. The silence consumed him. And as the city moved on, so did he, a man who had sought justice and found only the hollow echoes of his own destruction.